Congratulations to the class of 2020, Portland State University's Honors College. The Oregon author Ken Kesey writes in his novel Sometimes a Great Notion, "The great Northwest, where there is room for a man to be as big and important as it is in him to be." These are aspirational words, but I think it's maybe more accurate to say the great Northwest, where there is room for a man to be as big and important as it is in him to be, as long as he's a man and as long as he's white. As Oregon was forming, there was vigorous discussion as to whether or not Oregon would become a slave state. In the end, it was not, but that's not because white settlers were committed to equality. In 1844, the first of the black exclusion laws forced blacks to leave the Oregon Territory within 2 years or else be whipped no more than 39 times. When Oregon became a state in 1859, the state's constitution specifically denied Negroes, mulattoes, and Chinamen from voting or owning land. Article 1, Section 35 of the Bill of Rights laid it out plainly. No free Negro or mulatto shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein. The Oregon Donation Act of 1850 was designed to encourage white settlement in the Oregon Territory. A white settler could receive 320 acres of land, and if he was married, he could get another 320 acres. Black people, of course, were not eligible. It's also important to acknowledge that this land was stolen from people who had been living on it for centuries. Why am I talking about this? I'm a musician, but I'm also an historian. I majored in history and literature at Harvard, and I believe that we must understand our history if we're to move forward. At this moment in our city, our state, our country, our world, it is important to understand why we are where we are. Because I suspect that you care about what happens next as much as I do. White Oregonians generally have had very little interaction with people of color, so they are oblivious about what it means to be black or brown in America. And it starts with not knowing the history. In Oregon, the history of Native Americans, black and Chinese, among others, is not particularly well known. There are very few printed resources about black history in Oregon, for example. This is a major problem. I want to take a few moments to highlight a small fraction of that history. And for those of you graduates who are black or brown, this is all basic information. This speech is actually for your white classmates who may or may not be aware of some of this history. In 1870, Oregon refused to ratify the 15th Amendment that gave blacks the right to vote. Oregon didn't ratify this actually until 1959, when the heat was on because the state was celebrating its centennial and didn't want to look bad. In 1919, the Realty Board of Portland approved a code of ethics forbidding realtors and bankers from selling or giving loans to minorities for property located in white neighborhoods. Redlining is where banks deny mortgages to credit-worthy people, mostly people of color, preventing them from buying a home in certain neighborhoods or getting a loan to renovate their own homes. Redlining continues to this day. In the 1920s, the mayor of Portland, George Baker, and the governor of Oregon, Walter Pierce, were closely tied to the Ku Klux Klan. During World War II, white men who had been working in the Kaiser shipyards went off to war. Oregon's black population went from 2,000 to 22,000 because the shipyards needed labor. Portland Mayor Earl Riley begrudgingly lamented in 1942, quote, "Portland can absorb only a minimum number of Negroes without upsetting the city's regular life," unquote. Vanport, where Portland State began, was the city constructed for housing shipyard workers. It was one of the few places blacks in Oregon could legally live. But even Vanport was segregated. Although 1/3 of the population of the city was black, there were streets for white people and there were streets for black people. Parenthetically, many of these shipyard workers who were black were asked to sign agreements that they would leave Oregon after the war. Some of them did, some of them didn't. At the end of the war, when white soldiers returned to reclaim their jobs, blacks were left suddenly with no jobs. Much to the dismay of white Oregonians, as reflected in a 1947 article in the Oregon Journal, quote, "As one resident put it, the colored people have to live somewhere, and whether we like it or not, they are here to stay," unquote. In May 1948, torrential rains caused a dike to break, and within minutes the city of Vanport was engulfed in floodwaters. There weren't many housing options for black people in the aftermath. Most moved to the Albina neighborhood. But within a decade, that neighborhood was effectively decimated. Portland State scholar Karen Gibson writes in her paper, Bleeding Albina, A History of Community Disinvestment, that a series of decisions by white voters and white lawmakers thwarted blacks from being able to build stable lives, beginning with housing. In 1956, the city of Portland declared eminent domain for the construction of the Memorial Coliseum. 476 houses in Albina, mostly black occupied, were torn down. That same year, the Federal Aid Highway Act paid for the building of Interstate 5, which went right through the heart of Albina. And in the 1970s, the expansion of Emmanuel Hospital led to the clearing of 76 acres of the Albina neighborhood, including its main street. 300 black-owned homes, businesses, and shops were torn down. These urban renewal projects, which were happening in black neighborhoods all across the country, once again displaced black people to the margins. Many who tried to buy their houses were denied. They weren't able to get mortgages to buy or even fix up their homes. Some homes were abandoned. Some fell into decay. Values plummeted. In the late 1980s, Dominion Capital, a real estate investment company, acquired 350 of these houses. Dominion tricked black people into thinking that they were buying their homes, but in the fine print, there were huge balloon payments which could not be paid. A decade later, real estate prices were rock bottom. That's when young white people began moving in. They bought cheap houses and they started restoring them. The city suddenly started paying attention and began to invest in redevelopment of the neighborhood. But albina black people did not benefit from this. Some couldn't afford to pay for upkeep and taxes on their home as values started to rise. Others faced rising rents and were forced out. By 1999, black people owned 36% fewer homes than they had a decade earlier, while white people owned 43% more. An audit done by the Fair Housing Council of Oregon in 2011 concluded that landlords and leasing agents discriminated against black and Latino renters 64% of the time, citing them higher rents or deposits and adding on additional fees. In 1970, Robert Blanchard, superintendent of Portland Public Schools, proceeded with his Blanchard Plan, which dispersed black students by busing them out of their neighborhoods to various white schools. The cornerstone of this plan was to close Jefferson High School. The tireless 50-year activism of people like Ron Herndon and Joyce Harris, who graduated from Reed College in the early 1970s, kept Jefferson open. In fact, that school is thriving because individuals and institutions have invested in it. There is a program at Jefferson that is perhaps the best kept secret in regards to education in Oregon, and that is if you go to Jefferson High School all 4 years and maintain a certain GPA, you get a full ride to University of Oregon or Oregon State University. And then there are the police and the shootings and murders of young black people. In 1985, a black man named Lloyd Stevenson was killed by a policeman using a chokehold. Nobody was disciplined. In fact, on the day of Lloyd Stevenson's funeral, 2 policemen sold T-shirts to fellow officers bearing the slogan, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em." The officers were fired, but then they were eventually reinstated with back pay. 2 years ago, on this campus, Jason Washington, a black father, a U.S. postal worker, and a Navy veteran, was shot 9 times by 2 policemen. A grand jury cleared the 2 of wrongdoing. This history of black people in Portland and in Oregon is important to know. Most white people in the state don't know this history, don't think about this history, don't acknowledge it, and don't feel it. Simultaneously, because most Oregonians don't interact with people of color, their experience of black or brown people is largely shaped by the media. The German filmmaker Wim Wenders says, "You have to change the images of the world so as to change the world." If what we know is what we see on television, in films, in popular music, on our iPhones, then we are informed by assumptions that are false. Those assumptions affect how we behave and how we interact. Just look at the video of the woman in Central Park in New York who made choices as she dialed 911. Who is most likely to be believed in that scenario? Until more white Americans begin to understand and acknowledge the past and how that past is reflected in every aspect of modern American life, our country will continue to flounder. There has been a lot of discussion in white America asking, what should we do? What can I do? Educating oneself about our collective history is absolutely essential. Marching is one thing. It has been encouraging to see white America join these marches. But white people can, at any moment, especially when it is inconvenient, choose to leave the march and say, "I've done my part, and I've posted my marching on Instagram." Black people and brown people don't have that option. The great American author, abolitionist, statesman Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in Maryland and became one of this country's greatest social reformers, said in 1857, "Power concedes nothing without a struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the land. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." So, graduates of the 2020 class at Portland State University's Honors College, listen. Hear what people are saying. Once you know some of this history, use that history when having discussions with people who say there is no systemic racism in America. Use that history to talk with relatives, neighbors, coworkers who shrug and say they just need to lift themselves up. Once you know some of this history, you begin to have some understanding of who they are. You have greater empathy. Think about all the ways all of the institutions of this country, education, housing, jobs, healthcare, police, are built. All of these institutions need re-examination and recreation. Speak up when you see active discrimination. Look for places where humanity will be served by deconstructing structures that harm people. Help create new structures. Don't simply tear them down. Collaborate, listen, learn to compromise, do the hard day-to-day work. Don't just march and think you're done. Use what you have learned to help move and change the world. Ensure that other people are healthy. Ensure that they are well housed. Ensure that they have jobs. Ensure that they have possibilities. Lift people up. Go build the country you want to live in. Thank you.